scientist, researcher, and academic with extensive contributions to neuropharmacology, cognition, neurodevelopment, and psychopharmacology and translational neuroscience. He serves as the principal investigator of the Behavioural Neuroscience Research Group, where he leads multidisciplinary research exploring the interactions involving brain function, behavior, metabolism, environmental influences, and neurological health. His research interest spans behavioral neuroscience, experimental neurobiology, nutritional neuroscience, and the neurobiological basis of cognition and behavior. He has authored numerous peer-reviewed scientific publications in national and international journals, and has actively contributed to neuroscience education, mentorship, and research capacity development within Nigeria and internationally. I don't really know clap to that. Professor Onaolapo is also the editor-in-chief of Acta Biosciences, Journal of Biomedical and Biological Sciences, where he contributes to advancing scientific communication and promoting high-quality biomedical and neuroscience research. Beyond research, he is deeply committed to mentorship and interdisciplinary scientific engagement with a strong interest in integrating neuroscience with culture, society, philosophy, and public health perspective. Please, give a big hand as a welcome the first speaker of the day, Professor Onaolapo.
I'm going to be presenting society where culture meets neuroscience, neurobiology, cultural interactions and cognition, implications for the African neuroscience research, translational and clinical implications, future directions, and we will also be looking at critical medicine and cognition. Foundations of behavioral neuroscience. Behavioral neuroscience is a dynamic interdisciplinary field that was formed through the combined experimental methods of psychology, later joined by physiology. These two fields represent the very foundations of behavioral neuroscience. Now, it is also a field that has applications extending to many other fields, and it has over the years gained information from experimental biology, chemistry, animal behavior, computer science, engineering, and other fields. Now, in contrary to religious dogma, behavioral neuroscience is a field that shifts as new facts emerge. This is exemplified by core areas such as neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. Years ago, it used to be believed that new neurons cannot be formed in the brain of an adult human. But now, we are shifting focus regarding that. Now, one of the basic tasks of a behavioral neuroscientist is to explain behaviors by studying the processes that produce them. However, it goes beyond that. Because we must also understand the reason and the purpose of a behavior, alongside the factors that enhance such behaviors. Now, we cannot talk about behavioral neuroscience without talking about some of the pioneers and of historical importance and individuals such as René Descartes, who was a French philosopher, logician, mathematician, and a neuroscientist, a primordial neuroscientist, so to say, who examined the roles of the mind and the brain in controlling behavior. One of the things that Descartes examined was the mind-body problem, or the mind-body issue. What exactly is the mind? Where does it reside? Right? What is the relationship between the mind and the body? Those are among the things that Descartes examined. We talk about Luigi Galvani, a Spanish, an Italian neuroscientist who explored the connection of the nervous system to the body and behavior, how the nervous system is connected to the body and to behavior. Yes, Johannes Muller, the German physiologist, who researched the nature of electrical impulses in nerves. And we have others, such as for Broca. Some of us relate about Broca's area in the brain, Broca's effects, and Ramon Dada, who did a lot of work about the structure of neurons. Behavioral neuroscience took the street from trying to answer the mind-body question, which initially was a problem for philosophers. Later it became a problem for all scientists, particularly neuroscience. To this, there are two different parts. The concept of duality, the belief that the body is physical, while the mind or the soul is lost. We also have the concept of management, the belief that the world consists only of matter and energy, and that the mind is a phenomenon that is produced by the working of the nervous system. Under management, there is actually no mind-body problem, because it is believed that what we refer to as the mind is simply a product of the nervous system, and that once you understand the full work of the nervous system, the mind-body problem will be whole. In contemporary times, behavioral neuroscientists tend to take the humanistic approach to study human behavior. And as I've said, once we work out the fact that what we call the mind is actually the product of a working nervous system, then the mind-body problem simply goes away. But for us to understand the workings of the nervous system, we must start from the fundamental units, the neuron. We must also understand the basic connection, which is the synapse, and the common messengers that are used. Those are neurotransmitters. So we talk about neuron synapses and neurotransmitters. What are they? A neuron, that is where it all starts. Every building has a building block. Everything has a origin. When we talk about behavioral neuroscience, we cannot go without talking about the neuron, which is the basic functioning unit and the fundamental building block of the nervous system. Now, the neuron is a perfection of anatomy, physiology, and neurochemistry or biochemistry, all blended in one. To the right, we have the structure of what we refer to as a typical neuron. To the neuroanatomists, we know that there is really no typical neuron. A neuron has the following components: the cell body of the soma, dendrites that receive signals, axons that transmit impulses, synaptic terminals for the use of neurotransmitters, and of course the chemical messengers themselves, the neurotransmitters across synapses. What is the synapse? This is the microscopic junction between neuron and the next cell. I say the next cell because the next cell could be another neuron. It could be a muscle cell. It could be a glandular cell. Both electrical and chemical signaling exist in neurons, but we are more conversant with chemical synapses. But not all synapses are chemical synapses. We could have a purely electrical synapse. Now, synapses are essential for learning and memory, and this occurs through the process of long-term potentiation and long-term preparation. Now, These two processes underlie memory or the extinction thereof. Long-term potentiation simply means the increase in efficiency of the synaptic transmission of a synaptic connection, or the increase in efficiency of the neuronal cycle as that cycle is repeatedly used. Meanwhile, long-term depression is the opposite. It means that a decrease in the efficiency of the neuronal cycle as less information is routed through that pathway. A typical synapse actual potentials and travel along the neurotransmitter snapping the cycles receiving the chemical messengers and signals continue delivering neurons or other cells. Now, we have major neurotransmitters in the central nervous system. The ones that are of critical importance, they include dopamine, and these are the major sources of dopamine. The substantial nigra pars substantia and the ventral tegmental area. Now, the major pathways that arise from this, we call them the major dopaminergic projections of the brain. The first one is the nigrostriatal pathway that originates from the substantial nigra pars substantia and gets distracted, and it is involved in the regulation of voluntary movements. Degenerative changes involving the nigrostriatal pathway causes Parkinson's disease. Now, the second major pathway there is the mesolimbic. Meso implies origin from the ventral tegmental area. So we have the mesolimbic pathway, whose hyperactivity is associated with addiction and psychosis. Now, we have these neurons originating from the VT and synapsing in the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala. They mediate reward motivation and reinforcement. The third major pathway is the mesocortical pathway, coming from the ventral tegmental area and synapsing in the prefrontal cortex. This consists of neurons that are generally longer than the others. Hyperactivity in this region contributes to cognitive deficits that we see associated with schizophrenia. So, this mesocortical pathway is involved in cognition, attention, and executive function. The fourth pathway is a rather short pathway, the tuberoventricular pathway that regulates prolactin secretion, taking its origin from the hypothalamus and moving toward the pituitary gland. It functions in reward and pleasure motivation, motor control learning, and executive function. Now, this shows the major pathway involving dopamine in the brain. The tuberoventricular, the one that is below, which is rather short, mesolimbic pathway, mesocortical, and the nigrostriatal pathway. Now, the second neurotransmitter that is of crucial importance to brain functioning is serotonin, which takes its origin from the last nucleus of the brain cell. And serotonin projections are diffuse, going to so many different parts of the brain, including the cortex, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia, and even going as far as spinal cord. Functions include regulation, sleep and appetite, motivation, and emotional behavior. The role of serotonin, mood regulation, and emotional behavior is well recognized. That in neuropharmacology, we have subclasses of drugs that are dedicated to boosting the level of serotonin in the brain as treatment for depression and anxiety disorders. We have noradrenaline, whose major source is the locus ceruleus in the body. And noradrenaline, we all have an idea of what it does. But at the level of the brain, what it does is to increase attention, arousal, stress response, and vigilance. Now, what noradrenaline does is to enhance cortical alertness, especially during periods of stress and anxiety. neurotransmitter 2 is implicated in the pathogenesis of depression. And we have subclass, this is a subclass of antidepressant drug that deals with modulation of noradrenaline synthesis. The fourth neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. The structure appears simple. The biosynthetic pathway appears simple. A number of times when they ask medical students to pick the neurotransmitter, to talk about synthesis, they pick acetylcholine. But as scholars, it is a very important neurotransmitter. What are the major sources of acetylcholine? The major four pediculopontine nucleus and the brain cell nucleus functions in learning, memory, and attention. Sleep wake regulation, neuromuscular transmission. Of course, the neuromuscular transmission effect of acetylcholine is well known, but also is the learning and memory effect. In fact, loss of cholinergic neurons is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's disease is the most common dementia in the world. So, we have some classes of drugs that are used in the management of Alzheimer's disease that are actually dedicated to boosting the level of acetylcholine in the brain or to prevent degradation of acetylcholine. Glutamics. This is the major neurotransmitter of CNS, and it goes beyond that. Glutamics is actually the major neurotransmitter of CNS, with about 40% of the neurons in the brain being known to be glutamatergic neurons. So, about 40% of the neurons in the brain use glutamics as the neurotransmitter. The functions of glutamics include synaptic excitation, learning, memory, synaptic plasticity, and long-term presentation. In fact, a lot of the things that we talk about in behavioral neuroscience, especially when it comes to the area of cognitive neuroscience, involve glutamics. There is no way we can be talking about cognition and the cognitive abilities of the man without mentioning glutamics. However, excess glutamic activity can cause enterocortex neuronal damage. In fact, it is known that the level of glutamic in the central nervous system is so strictly regulated that a few molecules of glutamic cannot be allowed to just be roaming around the CNS. So, because it causes excessive excess glutamic can lead to exotic neuron damage and neuron death, as seen in situations such as cerebrovascular accident, that what we know as now, if glutamate has an opposite, the opposite of glutamate is GABA, which is GABA-aminobutyric acid. The GABAergic systems, they function as the inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain. Now, GABA acts to inhibit neuronal overactivity, maintain neuronal stability, regulate anxiety, and coordinate activities. Now, GABA is implicated in a number of CNS disorders, such as epilepsy. These are related to excess excitation of the brain. In a number of them, GABA is implicated. It's also implicated in the pathogenesis of anxiety disorder. Now, this just shows the GABAergic and the glutamatergic projections of the brain. And the glutamatergic projection appear red, while the GABAergic projection they are green. Now, as I said earlier, glutamatergic projections are more, with glutamate covering up to 40% of the human brain. Now, that being said, as in talking having discussed the functions of each neurotransmitter, one thing that is also important for us to know is that neurotransmitters rarely have independence. Instead, they interact dynamically through neural networks. Therein lies one of the great challenges of neuropharmacology, in the sense that whenever we are dealing with interact with glutamate in the reward circuitry. So when we are dealing with issues involving reward circuitry and addiction, we realize that we don't only deal with dopamine, we also have to factor in glutamate. So a number of times that is a challenge. We talk of serotonin GABA balance in emotional regulation. In fact, that of emotion, it goes and moves, goes beyond serotonin and GABA. Noradrenaline is also implicated. Acetylcholine glutamate interactions in memory cycle. So, a number of times in neuropharmacology, when we have to deal with these disorders, we are actually fighting against more than one neurotransmitter. Now, these are disorders, common disorders that are known to result from disruption of neurotransmitter balance, or common CNS disorders to lead to low neurotransmitter balance contributes. Depression, schizophrenia, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy and other seizure disorders, substance use disorders, and addiction. Just to mention it. Now, synapses to society. What do we mean by this? Having discussed the structural and the neurochemical components of the central nervous system, what do we mean by synapses to society? Now, synapses to society is an interdisciplinary framework that spans several sectors, including behavioral neuroscience and psychology. Now, in discussing synapses to society, we are actually looking at connecting what happens at the micro level, that is neurochemical events in the brain, to macro events that manifest at the level of the society. It encompasses behavior, social structures, and cultural norms. Essentially, when we are discussing synapses in society, we are actually looking at how the brain shapes the mind. The mind shapes the society and culture, and then culture and society shapes the mind. So it's a loop. So essentially, the brain shapes the mind shapes society and culture, and vice versa. What is a society? In what society is derived from the Latin word societas, meaning companionship, fellowship, or alliance. It means a group of people, and by extension, the relationships among them. And as we know, there can be a relationship without one or another, one form of communication or another. So, what is culture? The way of life of the people. It encompasses beliefs, values, customs, languages, and behaviors. Now, if society is a group of human beings, culture is the group that holds society together. So, we can argue that the sum of the expression of human behaviors is perceived as their culture. Therefore, human behavior emerges within social and cultural context. Now, where does culture meet neuroscience? Where does culture meet neuroscience? One, through the process of neuroplasticity, neural systems are shaped by repeated experience. That is, our experience in the society or the context of our culture shapes the way our brain responds. We will come to that. Experiences are shaped by culture, as culture influences our cognitive abilities, our emotions, and our behaviors. Therefore, society becomes biologically embedded, and our social experiences modify us, especially at the neurocellular level, especially at the neurochemical level, and to a lesser extent, at the neurocellular level. What I mean by that is this. What we experience in society, the content of our culture, shapes the neurotransmitter responses in our brain. Now, we will still come to explaining that in the course of the lecture. Now, neurobiology, culture, interactions, and cognition. In behavioral neuroscience, we always talk about the concept of cognition. our cognitive abilities. Let's see those. One, in defining our identity. In defining our identity. Culture defines our identity. And neurobiology also defines our identity. So, our identity as humans is defined by both culture and neurobiology. How is that? While culture defines societal rules, self-perception, and self-representation, which differs across culture, the brain gives us our identities through the medial prefrontal cortex. The medial prefrontal cortex is the neural hub of self-identity, self-reflection, and social cognition. This is the brain structure that allows us to distinguish ourselves from others. Therefore, biologically, the medial prefrontal cortex defines what we call the default self. Hence, identity is both defined by culture and neurobiology. And what we refer to as self is not a single entity. Emotion. Another place that neurobiology is called neurobiologically, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, anterior cingulate cortex, and insula are brain structures that participate in emotional process. However, when we look at culture, culture also defines how we perceive, interpret, express our emotions, determining the emotions to exhibit or suppress, and to what extent do we exhibit an emotion or suppress it. So, we look at two cultures, the Western culture and the Eastern culture. The Western culture encourages open expression of emotions, while the Eastern cultures encourages more of control of how much emotion is expressed. Hence, we have a situation where emotions and their expression vary culturally. What this means is this: while the brain structures are mentioned above, they participate in emotional processing. How the emotion is expressed, or to what extent the emotion is expressed, depends on the kind of culture. Western culture open expression. African culture control the expression. Eastern culture also control the expression of emotion. So, we have emotion being controlled both by neurobiology, which is brain structures, and the culture in which the individual finds him or herself. Another area is stress. Stress is culturally distributed, with differences in trigger, processing, rules of expression, and relative body. What is perceived as stress in one culture may not be so in another culture. I gave an example while I was teaching some students. I said, in Nigeria, if you are living in an area where you have electricity like 16 hours a day, you might perceive that as peace. Meanwhile, in some countries, having electricity 16 hours a day out of 24 hours a day is a big problem, right? So, what we perceive as stress varies from one culture to another. Culture defines what stress is. Now, the brain also perceives stress and processes it through structures such as amygdala, hypothalamus, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. These are brain areas that detect, provide context, and respond to stress. So, our brain responds to stress. Our culture also conditions how we respond to stress. So, the relative perception of body and coping mechanism of stress varies between individualistic and collectivist culture or society. We have individualistic societies in the West, where things that pertain to self are processed personally, so to say. So a man bears his own stress, right? And he responds appropriately. It's different from a collectivist society where it is believed that whatever person wants, the body is carried by others. So the way these two societies will respond to them, evades. Now, beyond that, evidence from experimental studies from our lab has shown that stress actually that in lower animals like rodents, stress actually have the ability not just to alter the neurochemistry of the brain, but the stress will actually alter brain structure. So we have situations where we have some stressors actually leading to loss of neurons in specific regions of the brain. So stress is culturally defined and neurobiologically defined. And from experimental studies, effect of stress can be seen not only on neurochemistry, but will also be seen on the neuroanatomy of the brain. What are the other areas where culture is important as it relates to neuroscience? Multilingualism. Now, multilingual cultures, people that belong to multilingual cultures, they have more cognitive flexibility and probably enhanced cognitive repertoire. And what is the reason for that? For somebody to be multilingual, you must have some form of advanced control over your brain. When you are speaking English, you shut the pathways and speak English. When you are speaking English, you shut the pathways and speak other language. So, multilingualism is a cognitive flexibility. In fact, it is believed that a lot of neuroscience knowledge can be gathered by studying multilingual societies. African linguistic diversity is important in this area because a number of we are multi-linguistic. Nigeria has over 520 languages, if I'm correct. Some of us, even we have in our region, we have general Yoruba exists, then there is dialect Yoruba, then there is more. So, it is believed that in neuroscience, the linguistic diversity that exists in Africa creates a fertile soil for research involving the aspect where multilingualism is linked to cognitive capabilities. As I always say, if man originated from Africa, then the original brain is an African brain. So, if you want to study a number of things regarding the brain, I think it's better that you study the African. Now, parenting. How does parenting affect cognitive capabilities? Authoritative parenting, not authoritarian. Authoritative parenting promotes optimal cognitive functioning. What is authoritative parenting? A lot of words and a lot of expectations of the children. It's different from authoritarian parenting, where the parents are old, yet they expect a lot from the child. So authoritative parenting promotes optimal cognitive function. Now, we also have the roles of epidemics, nutrition, and trauma. These are things that alter gene expression. The issue of nutrition is very important. A number of times, we say it's difficult for a child that is not well fed to be nutritious. And that is true, because nutrition plays a lot of role. If we factor in, if you take into cognizance the fact that the brain consumes 25% of the calories that we take. In fact, I used to joke that the human central nervous system is one large parasite that preys, it's a parasite, or a predator that preys on the other organs, commanding the other organs to provide sustenance for it so that it continues to live at the same time, telling them what to do. So nutrition plays a role. Epigenetics too, that is things that we experience in the society, things that we experience externally, how they are able to alter the neurochemical products of the brain. So all these things affect our cognitive capabilities. What are the implications for neuroscience research in Africa? Now, we know we are still underrepresented in the global neuroscience research, despite our rich socio-cultural and genetic diversity. Now, some of the areas where our socio-cultural and genetic diversity comes to bolster research and mention them. Now, also, we need to look inward and create our own opportunities. This is an example. As was earlier mentioned, this is an indigenous neuroscience. So it's about looking inward to create our own opportunities and believing that we have what it takes. Now, works of authors like Onaolapo and Onaolapo should be deeply studied as indigenous textbooks of behavioral and cultural neuroscience. Why? There are some books that stand up. From Amos to whether we have the Hawaii and by like the Bush of Books, Onaolapo death and the King's Husband. Now, if Amos to Onaolapo were considered as a fantasy or escapist fantasy, that Onaolapo death of the King's Husband is actually based on a full life story, something that happened in Onaolapo during the colonial era. And it was about how cultures perceive things like fear, duty, and how people fit into their role in the society. How different cultures will perceive those roles. Now, with one culture looking at it as, oh, this is this man's fit towards the society. And the other culture looking at it that, oh, this man, what he wants to do shows sheer value. What actually happened in Death and the King's Husband was about the King's Husband, the belief, the cultural belief that the King's Husband should die whenever the king dies. Right? Whenever the king dies, the man was committed to a ritual society so that he will follow his master to the afterlife. But this particular case happened during the colonial era, with the colonial administrator believing that after some people take to that kind of belief that it was mentally insane. And he tried to intervene, and at the end of the day, it actually ended in catastrophe. So, this work of Amos Onaolapo